Hey everyone, today we're going to take a look at the D&D 4th edition book, Into the Unknown, the Dungeon Survival Handbook. We'll look at every page together and I will give my thoughts along the way. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. If you'd like to get this book for yourself, I will put some links down in the description where you can get a PDF or even a physical copy. This book was released on May 5th, 2012, and was the last book to actually use the D&D 4th edition rules. By the time this book was released, Wizards had already announced that they were working on a new version of the game. There would only be one other book for 4th edition, Menzoberranzan City of Intrigue, but that book was stripped of all references to 4th edition and contained no mechanics. I have a page-through video for that book if you're interested in it. The front cover of Into the Unknown includes art from Wayne Reynolds, while the back cover is by Ralph Horsley, both of whom provided art for several 4th edition products. In looking at this book, I feel that it's another example from 4th edition where Wizards had an idea for a whole series of books, but we only ended up getting one of them. We did get 2 players option books, and then we got 2 players races books, and we got a couple of adventure location books. This looked like it was going to be a series of books for players and dungeon masters that provided strategies on how to play and run certain types of locations. This one covered dungeon settings, but maybe future books would have covered the wilderness or the Underdark or other locations. But the short life of 4th edition meant that this was another idea that was never fully realized. Before we get into the details, if you enjoy these videos, please click that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what other D&D 4th edition books you would like me to walk through next. Let's get started. The book is just 3 chapters, but there's a ton packed into each one. We get a lot of character tools to help us flesh out the backstories for our characters. There are 3 monsters that we can now use as playable races. There's some different dungeon types and what you might find in those dungeons, and then a bunch of dungeon master tips for running a campaign, and then 2 appendices with tools for the dungeon masters. The first section is Dungeon Delvers, and this is all about tools for the players. It contains information with new character themes, those races that I had mentioned that you can now use for player characters, as well as a whole bunch of new power options as you level up your character. There are 7 different character themes to choose from, and it depends on what type of character you're trying to run. There's tips for choosing a theme that is best for you, and then you can change your theme as your character evolves if you decide that you want to go into a different direction. There's also information that you can use to tie each of these themes to a campaign. As we look at each of the themes, you'll see that they are basically an expansion of the races and classes that you get in the other books. There's a lot of information on how to play and build one of these. A Bloodsworn, it has a sworn enemy that can be pretty interesting in a campaign. There's a sidebar that talks about how Bloodsworn are never satisfied with just simply slaying their enemies. They want to put together elaborate plans to stretch it out as much as they can. You'll see that you get a feature for the theme as well as some additional class power options. And then you get an example of a build that you can use as a guide to help you when you're trying to create your own character. And I like that they give a lot of examples in this book because it really helps players connect that theory with the reality. Deep Delvers live for the challenge of exploring the dungeons. They have powers that give them advantages on dungeoneering checks and against things that they might experience while in the dungeons. Escaped Thrall are those that are imprisoned by aboliths or mind flayers or other creatures that would have left emotional trauma on them. They are scarred characters, but as a result, they have a strong resolve against psychic powers. Trapsmiths are what you would expect. They are experts at creating traps to achieve their goals. There are some tips on creating a good trap. Powers are about creating different types of traps. There's a sidebar that gives some tips on how you might just temporarily disable a trap to leave it for others to stumble across, or maybe you just delay the trap long enough for your party to pass by. Treasure hunters are looking to get rich. They are thrill seekers. The sidebar here talks about prioritizing the treasure by portability, rarity, and other factors if for some reason you can't take all the treasure with you. The powers here allow you to find specific items and help you with thievery and initiative. The Underdark is a place where everyone seems to be scheming against each other, and the Underdark envoy theme really lives into that. They are experts at diplomacy and playing people against each other so that you always come out ahead. If you're familiar with Game of Thrones, think of the character Littlefinger. And then finally we have the Underdark Outcast. This character would either be banished due to a violation of their society, or you banished yourself for personal reasons. Either way, you are a loner, you are out for yourself, and you are very self-sufficient. You seek companions that don't ask a lot of questions about your backstory. And the next section covers races. There are 3 races that you can use now as player characters. The first is a Goblin. This is a small race, and you get the Goblin tactics that allow you to shift when an enemy misses in their attack. The Adventurer section covers how a Goblin would be great for playing a rogue, an assassin, a wizard, or bard. And I love that you get some tips on how to role play a Goblin character. This can be really important as you're building your character, especially for a new player where you're not really sure what it means to be a Goblin character, but those role-playing tips can really help you out. You get 6 new feats exclusively for Goblins, as well as 6 heroic to your goblin powers. The next race we have is a kobold, also a small character. You get shifty maneuver that allows you and allies to shift as a free action. These characters would be great at detecting traps, and the recommended classes are rogue, sorcerer, warlock, and assassin. There are role-playing tips that point out how kobolds worship dragons as gods, so this could be an interesting trait during a campaign if the party comes upon a dragon. For the Kobold, we get 5 new feats plus 5 new powers, and the last race we get is the Sverfneblin. These are known as Deep Gnomes in other editions, which is much easier to pronounce. The special trait that you get here is Stone Camouflage, which allows you to blend into your surroundings and gain concealment. These characters very much value the community that they come from. There's a sidebar that mentions how they might even use the word we, where others would be using the word I. This is a great race if you're wanting to play a druid, a cleric, a ranger, or a warden, but naturally you can mix things up however you want to. They value strength in numbers, and they definitely know their way around the Underdark. This race includes 4 feats and 7 new powers. The dungeon-themed powers section explores why a character spends time in the dungeon, so it goes into some backstory elements that you can use to help flesh out your character goals. It also provides powers for specific classes and some skill powers which were introduced in the Player's Handbook 3. First, Fear of the Dark is a bunch of powers dealing with darkness and light and visibility. Secrets of the Deep guides are characters that are interested in exploring the depths of the Underdark. Note that each section provides some natural fits for the classes you might want to play, so in this case the Deep guides would be well suited to be a druid. The powers here deal with terrain and creative movement. Shadow of the Ziggurat is characters who have a desire to fight aberrations like aboleths, beholders, and mind flayers. These powers help you against those types of creatures and provide bonuses to constitution and will. Seekers of Lost Lore are characters driven by curiosity. You like to learn about the locations and how those locations got to be the way they are, and you like to use that knowledge to make your character better. The powers here deal psychic damage and are based on the character's wisdom. Thieves Guild of Malbrather is a network of thieves and spies trading in information. It's very dispersed, so it's hard to say who's exactly in charge. The powers here focus on gaining strategic advantages, as you might expect from like a rogue. From the Vault of the Drow are worshippers of Lolth. Female Drow characters would be especially suited for this background, and male bards and sorcerers would also fit pretty well. The powers here play on the key attributes of the Drow, such as their devotion to Lolth. And the last one is Battle Tactics of Kor Talkor. This is best for the fighters in the group. This one is all about power in combat. You get 8 new powers built around strength, athletics, and healing in battle. Chapter 2 is Strive to Survive. Chapter 1 was all about building a character for the dungeons. Chapter 2 is now about how to have success while exploring a dungeon. First of all, we get 5 tips to keep in mind while you're exploring the dungeon. Don't split the party, map everything, make sure you have plenty of gear with you to help you solve problems. Don't lose track of how much time you're spending in the dungeon, and definitely know when you are in over your head, and don't be afraid to retreat. The rest of the chapter digs into more detail on several aspects of adventuring in a dungeon. Expert Delving Tactics deals with the question of how does one actually delve into a dungeon? What are the key things to keep in mind? This section highlights all the different skills and abilities that you need to take advantage of. For example, climbing is critical while you're in a dungeon, and it reminds you that having a climbing kit grants you a +2 bonus on athletic checks while you are climbing. And also mentions that using a candle to find a draft can grant you a bonus to a check to find a secret door. Finding food is often a challenge in a dungeon. Using the dungeoneering skill would help you find enough to survive, and there's plenty more, such as dealing with water hazards and traps. The whole section focuses on how you can use all the skills that you put together for your character effectively while you are in a dungeon. Then there's a whole section on the different rituals and how they can benefit the party while you're in a dungeon. Note that these are not new rituals. This is just advice on how to use the ones that you got from the other players' handbooks. Next, it goes into 11 different dungeon types. Not all dungeons are the same. They weren't created for the same reasons, and they don't currently serve the same purpose, so they should not be treated the same. This section goes through several different kinds and the things that you'll want to keep in mind while you're in those dungeons. First, we get a cave. This is the most basic dungeon, but there are many different types of caves. They all tend to have challenging terrain, and you can get pretty much any kind of creature in these, ranging from bears all the way up to an entire clan of goblins. Crypts would be filled with traps and curses and undead creatures, but usually also rewards you with ancient treasures and artifacts. Death traps are designed to kill you. Floating castles can be an entire dungeon floating in the sky, likely found in the Feywild area. There's a sidebar that explains exactly how you walk on a cloud. Ice palaces would have difficult terrain, slippery surfaces, falling icicles. Usually they would be the home of white dragons and frost giants, with huge stashes of treasure to be found. Magic laboratories are where you would find wizards and mad alchemists. They'd be filled with strange creatures and be a great source for potions and elixirs and other magic items. Mazes can take the form of a traditional maze, but can also consist of teleportation pads and complex puzzles to confuse the party. These can be best when they extend vertically and not just in 2 dimensions. You'll need to give some thought to what reward lies at the end of the maze, as it's going to need to be something special. Mines will usually have been constructed by dwarves or gnomes or kobolds. There's a lot of different dangers from the difficult terrain inside the mine, along with the ancient machinery that might be out there. You have to ask if the mine is going to be active or is it abandoned, and if it's abandoned, why was it abandoned? A prison is a great place for an adventure to start, to have the party all locked up without any of their gear and they have to figure out how to escape. Questions to consider are, what kinds of defenses would this prison have? What about the fellow inmates? Are they friends? Are they foes? Or are they spies for the people that imprisoned you? Sewers can have lots of traps in them, but they also could provide access to other areas of the city if you manage to clear out the sewers of the dangers. They usually have a lot of vile creatures that feed on the waste down in the sewers, and these are great places for thieves' guilds to hide out. Volcanoes are places where you'd have a lot of survival checks because they're inhospitable and hot. You would really need a high constitution score to survive here, and you'd typically find a lot of elemental creatures in this area. And finally, a warren is basically a home to a clan of creatures like goblins or kobolds. It's not necessarily defended, but outsiders are not usually welcome either, so it's a great place to have some role-playing encounters. The next section is Dungeon Denizens. It contains a list of some of the creatures that are common to the dungeon settings. So over these several pages, it builds on information that you would find for those creatures in the monster manuals. There's a sidebar that talks about how you should plant seeds to give the players an idea of what monsters might lie ahead. Aboleths like to build monolithic structures near their lairs, so as the party is exploring a dungeon, make sure they come across some monolithic structures. Abnormally clean rooms indicate that an ooze might be nearby, and a vile stench that grows worse as the party descends into the dungeon could indicate the presence of troglodytes. The next section talks about some infamous dungeons, so it gives examples of well-known dungeons throughout D&D's history. The first one you get is Castle Ravenloft, home of Count Strahd von Zarovich. One of the sidebars gives you a little history about Ravenloft and how you can fit it into your campaign. The next one you get is the Ghost Tower of Inverness, originally published in 1980. The Lost City comes from 1982. Pyramid of Amun-Re is from the early 80s. It has an ancient Egyptian theme and became part of a series of adventures in the 1980s. This one was created by Tracy and Laura Hickman, who also created Ravenloft and Dragonlance. White Plume Mountain is from 1979. Tomb of Horrors goes all the way back to 1975. The Temple of Elemental Evil was originally published as just the Village of Hamlet in 1979, and then expanded into a full adventure in 1985. And finally, Gates of Firestorm Peak was only ever published for 2nd edition, but it does have a loyal following of fans. And the final section of this chapter is the Dungeoneer's Tools. This is several pages of gear that could come in handy for an adventuring party. First, there's 13 new items, such as a listening cone and a hacksaw, and then there are 6 alchemical items. Note that each of these items has a key skill that you need to be trained in order to use that particular item. Chapter 3 is Master of the Dungeon. Naturally, this is my favorite part. It has tools for the Dungeon Master to build an amazing campaign in a dungeon. There are tips not only for creating the adventure, but how to run it so that it's memorable. The first section is called Involving the Characters. First, it talks about themes and adventure hooks and mentions how good hooks fall into one of a few different categories. For example, with foreshadowing, you plant clues that relate to the backstory of a character, and you allow that character to make the connection. The pages here provide hooks that you can use for each of the different character themes that were provided early in the book. For example, a treasure hunter might find a manuscript with an image of an Eladrin from the Feydark wearing a crown. This can be tied to other clues that you've laid that point to the location of this crown, causing that player to want to go after the treasure. The Exploration and Choices section gives advice on how to ensure the party does not need to make decisions based purely on chance. You want to provide clues such as sounds and smells and obstructions that they can use to inform their decisions on which way to go. And the next section is Mysteries and Puzzles. Not everyone likes puzzles, and you got to make sure you're clear about whether you're testing the players or the characters. There's a lot of debate about this, and the right answer, as always, is whatever your table prefers. And next we get a section about creating an Underdark adventure. It points out here that the Underdark is not just a dungeon, it is an entire world built underground. Those familiar with Storm King's Thunder might recognize this map as the Dripping Caves from Chapter 1 of that adventure module. Infinite Scope gives a little background on what the Underdark is. And the next sections talk about how you want to really use the setting almost as another character in the story. Provides a lot of hints about the sorts of things that you would include that are often overlooked but can add a ton of flavor to the location. You need to know what kind of adventure you're making. Is it about exploring, or is it about combat, or is it about puzzles? Make sure you have a plan and you put all this stuff together and it makes sense. Under developing the plot, you want to start with a great hook for your characters. You want them to feel like they are part of this campaign, and then build a story from that hook that will keep them engaged. This can be based on the characters' backstories, or a monstrous plot, or just a plain old treasure hunt. The Underdark Combat Encounters talks about the battlefield and how it can make or break your encounter. Make sure that you think about elevation, terrain, and light to keep things interesting. You want to avoid those large open square rooms for your battles because they're kind of boring. The sidebar here is great because here in the real world, we don't always know the right word to describe something. This is a nice little glossary to help the DM as they're describing the environment. And then we get a skill challenge. This is a nice example of a skill challenge that you can use right out of the book for your own encounter. This one includes individual checks and group checks. As I've said before, I recommend taking the core intention of the skill challenge and focusing on letting the player solve the problem. Don't get too bogged down in the dice rolls and successes and failures. This particular challenge includes several explanations about how you can make it more interesting by adding additional features. The Dungeon Maker section goes into why the dungeon is here, who created it, why is it in the state that it's in now. The more that you as the Dungeon Master know about the history of the dungeon, the more real it will seem for the players, and it will make it a lot easier for you to answer questions during the game. And there are several examples given here that you can use. Cultists building a new society, a drow fortress, a Duragar city, a dwarven mine with obstacles and strong defenses, a human settlement or maybe even a hideout, a kobold warren that you might stumble across, a Kuatoa lair, a mind flayer dungeon, a minotaur maze, a wizard's laboratory, or a Wanti refuge. The sidebar has a number of interesting things that a party might find in a wizard's dungeon. These can be interesting seeds for future adventures or even for side quests. And then we get special rewards. The best dungeons are ones that are going to offer something beyond just typical gold and potions and mundane items. There's a number of magical scrolls that you could give away: mass heal, polymorph, power word kill, and then it has a section about a wish scroll. The sidebar here mentions how the DM needs to be really careful with how they use this one. And Dungeon Companions is some NPCs that you might come upon in a dungeon that can help the party either directly or by providing information. You might recognize some of these from other published adventures. The first appendix is Build Your Own Dungeon, and as a dungeon master and an amateur fantasy cartographer, creating a dungeon is one of the things I enjoy the most about D&D. Here we get a number of tips to help you in that regard. The first is deciding if the dungeon is linear, where the party has one route that they can take through the dungeon, or if there will be multiple paths where they can make decisions as they go. Naturally, dynamic dungeons can be more interesting for the players, but they're also going to be harder to run for the dungeon master. In the Rough It Out section, it mentions how you should use what's been presented so far in this book to help you come up with the idea for this dungeon, and then you start sketching out your dungeon. There are tools in the Dungeon Master's Guide as well as later in this book to help you with that process. Dungeon Synergy is an interesting section talking about how you need to make the dungeon seem real and not like it's actually a game. And Unique Challenges is where you ask the question, what makes this dungeon something special and memorable? You need to make sure that you give your dungeon a unique appearance from other dungeons that they've been in. And don't be afraid to alter monsters to fit your dungeon. When the party sees a kobold, they might have an idea for how hard that's going to be, but if you give that kobold special armor and change some of its stats, that's going to keep the party on their toes and make it more interesting. And then Appendix 2 is a bunch of tables to help you create random dungeons. This is not really about creating the shape of the dungeon, but the tables to help you give the dungeon a personality. Who created the dungeon? What type of dungeon is it? Where is it located? What is the purpose of the dungeon today? What are its defenses, weaknesses, strange effects? And then you populate the dungeon with people and monsters. I particularly like the quirks that you can assign to the creatures that the party might come across in the dungeon. This is a great tool to make the dungeon master's job easier as they have to role play these creatures. And then finally, it has an example of going through all these tables and randomly generating a dungeon and what that might look like. And the final page of the book is a plug for DungeonsandDragons.com. This book was a bit of a mixed bag for me. Chapter 1 was okay. Players might find it interesting. There's some cool new features offered, and I like that you can play as some new races, but I found the character themes to be a little lacking. The information presented was interesting, but I have to ask myself, who is really going to use this? I think it's so highly specialized for a small subset of players that's going to be a tough sell to get them to buy this book. If you're a player that likes to create huge backstories for your characters, then this book might be good for you. But if you're one that likes to roll up stats and then just go with it, all these extra themes and everything aren't going to mean a whole lot for you. In chapter 2, the book starts to hit its stride. I like the approach of providing tools to help players be more successful at the game. I think this is especially true for new players that don't really know what they're supposed to do. I could see them reading through this chapter and learning all the little cheat codes that they can use to help get the most from their characters. It's sort of like what we see today with some of the community 5th edition materials that tell you what spells you can use to max out your character and what other decisions you should make as you're leveling up. It has that same sort of feel for me. And this chapter starts to get into the tools for the dungeon master as they're building out the dungeon to help them create locations that seem natural and not arbitrary. The section on infamous dungeons was interesting, but it really seems like filler that they added to get the page count up to what they needed. I don't think there's a lot of value in going through all those old dungeons. I would like to have seen them add more magic items to the book. Chapter 3 was definitely the best from my perspective. 4th edition was known for being a great version for DMs, and I see that in Chapter 3. There's a ton of information to help you build out a campaign set in a dungeon. You get everything that you need to make that dungeon a character in the adventure. The 2 appendices are a nice way to bring it all together by providing the Dungeon Master with tools that connect all the dots laid out in the rest of the book. When used in combination with the Dungeon Master's Guide, this can be really helpful. Overall, I feel like this would have been better as 2 smaller books, a Player's Guide to Dungeons and a Dungeon Master's Guide to Dungeon creation. As it is, it has a ton of great information, but it seems like it's trying to be too much. But let me know what you think. Did I get it right? Did I overlook something that you enjoyed in this book? Let me know down in the comments, and please share what other 4th edition books you would like me to look at next. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, take care.